In this section of the course, we're taking chapter 5 as the basis of what we're going to be discussing. And the author, his big question is individual human agency responsible for the structure of our society? So we've looked at this idea earlier in the course already, that kind of idea of structure versus the individual. So I want to address actually a question, my own question, which is how rational are we? And I think this really, in this section of the course, becomes a very important question, how you feel about that, because many of the theories that emerge out of the Enlightenment and emerge out of early social theory postulates human beings as almost 100% rational, that people act from rational impulses, that they make decisions from rational deliberation, and that these other forces in life kind of don't exist. And so this is why I want to problematize this a little bit, because certainly if we go back to thinking about psychology as we've been discussing it, the idea of the unconscious, the idea of all these other aspects of the self that aren't just rational, is not taken on board by these theories, and I think it really limits their utility. And as I said at the very beginning of the course, I'm always interested in, can we apply these theories? Are they useful? Or do they help us to understand the world? Do they help us to understand ourselves? So as always, I leave it up to you to think about this, but I do want to sharpen that question a little bit. Can we really assume that human beings are always rational? As he does in all the chapters, man starts with this sort of tale, Athena's tale of a person. So what he's trying to do here is situate these, as you have seen, very often very abstract, difficult to understand theories in a human life. So how would we see it working out in a human life? And so he gives the example of a person. She is 25 years old, the offspring of a family of Greek immigrants who are Orthodox churchgoers and deeply committed to traditional family values. Okay, so after almost studiously ignoring religion throughout this textbook, he's bringing religion in here. And so I will be going into much more detail about this next time when we're talking about religion in the next part of the course. I'll be looking at this in much more detail, but certainly religion is a very good example of where people aren't always motivated by rationality. So, for instance, if I give money to charity, that's not particularly rational. That might be coming out of my belief that I might be a believing Muslim who believes that you have to give to those in need. So he's bringing this into the picture here, that these Greek, not just religious, but Greek cultural traditions impact on this person and her decisions. Athena's father, Apollo, wanted desperately for her to attend law school, graduate into a good job, marry a nice Greek boy, and settle down to raise a couple of grandchildren. Her mother, Aphrodite, also wanted her to get married, but to a doctor or some other professional man who would support her so she could follow in her mother's footsteps by raising a big family. And so here he's setting up that dynamic of how our family expectations and our family dynamics also limit our choices often, or at least shape them profoundly. So he goes on to ask, how much free will do we possess and use in the next section of the textbook, entitled Human Agency versus Social Structure? And so he says, we all face the sorts of decisions that Athena has made. Many of us fancy ourselves to be free human agents who can fully explain what we do, why we do what we do. So I think this is maybe one of the great illusions. Again, you'll have your own opinions about this, but it's been my experience that when you directly ask somebody why they did something, particularly if it wasn't something pleasant, they often don't know why. So I think these things are often unconscious to us. So he says, yet when push comes to shove, most of us are also all too willing to justify at least some of our less pleasant decisions as forced on us by social structures beyond our own control. So he gives the example of when a boss is being told by upper management to fire a bunch of people. So he or she can say, it's not me, I care about these people, but I'm being told what to do by the bureaucracy. So he's basically saying that this is an innate tension within all human societies, how much free will we have. And so within philosophy, it's generally described as free will versus determinism. And he brings up Jean-Paul Sartre, who we've already discussed in an earlier part of the course. And Sartre would be on the far end of the spectrum, saying we have complete free will. And so the existentialists tend to bring it all back to the individual and individual free will, as we discussed in that section. So he says, on the other side are determinists who argue that the universe is structured according to set physical laws that we can't change at will. So this includes things like biology. So we looked at the sociobiologists that were much more controlled by our inheritance in our biology than we like to think, perhaps. And so also, how much of our behavior is determined by social systems such as family, class, gender, state, culture. And so you can already see, even from this short discussion, that there are many factors that would impact choices that people are making. And so I want us to hold that as we're looking at some of the ideas that I'm bringing forward in this section. So we're revisiting Max Weber at this point, and this is partly because he's so influential. He influences so many streams of social thought and theory, and he certainly gets taken up by religious studies, which I can talk about more when we get to that section of the course. And so you can read through this section. Some of it we've covered, some of it I'm going to be highlighting now. So Weber's sociology takes what's called a Verstehen approach. It attempts to understand social action as meaningful on the individual level by interpreting the subjective meaning given an act by the actor. So this is where I actually think Weber's very balanced. He balances the structural aspects that influence us, but also the individual. As we saw with the Protestant work ethic, he was taking very seriously the way that Protestant values were impacting people, and as capitalism was developing. And so he attempts to understand social action in a time of extreme cultural flux. And so we're going to be looking at these different types of motivations. So he's asking what's motivating people, and he's taking how they understand it seriously. So he argues that the forms of action are traditional, affective, value rational, and instrumentally rational. And so he discusses this on page 148 of your textbook. And so let's just take it one by one here. Traditional action, which occurs when an actor says, this is the way we've always done things, so this is the way I'll do it now. And so this, of course, is very common. And I talked a little bit about this when we looked at the superego and this section on psychology, that we can't be thinking through every single action of the day. We'd be completely paralyzed. Nobody does that. I'm not questioning why I'm brushing my teeth in the morning. I mean, I might, but then I'm falling into an anomic state, or I'm rejecting the basic laws of hygiene of my society, which can lead to other problems. So I'm not doing that. I'm just moving through the day. I'm doing what has always been done. And that is, of course, shaped by my family of origin. It's shaped by my culture, by my community, by the job that I do. And so he says, this is the most common form of action in everyday life. It is only barely meaningful, since it usually involves little thinking. An example is an old-fashioned marriage ceremony. So to take us back to that first example of Athena, who's coming out of that Greek family, both of her parents expect her to have a Greek Orthodox wedding. And so if you've seen the fantastic movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, you'll know how vast that is as an undertaking. And all the cultural aspects that go along with it and the community aspects. And so religion definitely slots in here as in terms of shaping things in the background. And I would argue that it doesn't mean it's not meaningful. It just means it's a kind of shorthand. And so if we look at it in the other way, if people, and increasingly people, are rejecting traditional marriage ceremonies, what does that mean? And I teach a whole ritual course on this, asking the question of, if we do away with all of these traditional ceremonies and rituals and so on, how is that going to impact our society? And so he says a lot of our actions are just coming out of this. This is how it's always been done. This is how I do it. The second one is effectual action based on the actor's emotion. So again, Weber is recognizing that human beings aren't just intellectual. So if we look at that Cartesian idea, I think, therefore I am, that human beings are fundamentally creatures that think. Weber would agree with that, but he would say they have many other aspects to the self, which includes emotion. And this also goes a long way to explaining why people do things that seem against their own interests or seem irrational, because they are irrational. They're acting out of emotion. And so obviously, generally, somebody's choice around who they marry is going to be largely irrational by this measure. And so so the example that he gives are quite negative, but a bar fight and road rage, I'm sure there are other more pleasant forms of emotional expression than that. But I guess he's highlighting the irrational nature of emotions and the way in which they can lead to actions that are not always positive. And certainly in our society, I would argue that to show emotion in certain settings is frowned upon. Certainly in certain professions, you expect to keep your emotions out of it. So you don't expect your medical doctor or nurse to burst into tears, for instance. So it's this idea that emotions in our society, I would say, are expected to be in the private realm. Now that's cultural. I don't think that's true in all cultures. So the next is value rational action, which is connected to a conscious belief in some ethical, religious, or aesthetic value for its own sake. This could be action aimed at some political cause, defending one's nation, or pursuing a religious calling. So this is the idea that people act from moral values, and again, you can see how this reads very well onto religion. And so just to give an example, if you've been watching the news, you'll have seen has been going on in Minnesota, Minneapolis in the U.S., where people in the streets have been clashing with ICE, which is this kind of paramilitary police force sent to bring in supposedly illegal immigrants. And so here's an example where if you apply social theory, it will depend on how you view the world and how you view other human beings. And so if we go by Weber and we ask people why they're doing what they're doing, I've seen people being interviewed and I've been reading the placards. So there's one where the person's holding up a sign saying, be moral, and another one that's saying, protect your neighbor. So you can see this is moral/religious language that these people are drawing on. This is nothing to do with just an emotional state, for instance, that they're angry and they're rioting. And so, however, if we change the channel and we listen to somebody from certain news stations, they would say these are criminal deviants, they're people who are rioting, they're not respecting authority, and so on. So again, I think it's always important to look at things through that lens of who's talking and why, and who's analyzing this in this way. So that's just one example of the way that people act from their values. So the last one is instrumental rationality. And so this seeks to use objects and people to achieve rationally calculated ends. This is sounding very Machiavellian and disturbing, because Machiavellianism is actually one of the dark triad in psychology. It's considered a kind of a pathological trait. But here it's being presented as semi-desirable. So this idea that we're just thinking rationally about what's good for ourselves, and then we act accordingly. And even the goals of action themselves are evaluated. To this sort of actor, value rational action seems irrational, since it ignores the consequences of action. For example, from an instrumentally rational point of view, joining the priesthood might seem highly irrational, since it doesn't quote-unquote pay off like a good job in the corporate world. Most of modern economic life is instrumentally rational. It seeks to make money in the most efficient way possible. So I think probably Weber's being critical here, but he's definitely recognizing this as one of the drivers. And if we look at, it's interesting to look at financial people online or in books, and they come very much from this point of view. And so they often become very annoyed by the fact that people, when it comes to money, are often acting from value or often acting emotionally. And I'll just give an example with money, because it's one I've experienced, where someone will say, I'm Scottish, I'm frugal. They're not thinking, oh, it's my Calvinist values and this is why I'm doing this. From an instrumental point of view, that all has to be thrown out. It has to just be a monetary calculation of a very kind of clear-cut calculation of good and bad. It has nothing to do with your emotions or your family background or your religion or any of these things. And so I'll give an example of this. Choosing a university. So one way to do that would be to just go through all the pages of the universities and see which one has the most prestige, which one gives the most money out in scholarships, which ones will get me further ahead in life. This kind of calculation, and that is certainly clearly the way many of us choose a university. That's part of it. But I've asked students this question over the years, and oftentimes actually the answer will be something like, I had chosen my university. Sometimes it's because my parents went to that university, and then I took the campus tour, and I just decided to go to Nipissing or whatever university based on the feeling of the campus and the people that I met. So I think what's important here, which often in the way textbooks are laid out, it sets it up as kind of oppositional. I think people calculate in all of these ways, often for the same decision. So I might be coming at university in a traditional way that my family thinks this is of an important value, but I also may be coming at it emotionally because my friends are going there, or someone I'm dating is going there, or I could be looking at it because it aligns with my values. All of these things can be in play. So I think it will depend on the person which one is stronger, but I think it is important to see that Weber is giving all of these together because they're all impacting social action. Again, related to the time period that he's in, Weber is grappling with the idea of what gives legitimacy to society. And so he's coming out of a culture where they have done away with the monarchy, they've done away with the aristocratic class. And so the question becomes, how do you then ground your society? What gives it legitimacy? And this is an ongoing challenge for all secular democracies because on some level it's shifting sand. What are you grounding it in? So for instance, people will say, usually as a knee-jerk reaction, the legitimacy comes from the people. Okay, but what does that mean? That means you vote every 4 years? Is that what we mean by that? Legitimacy comes from the Constitution. That's often one of the arguments made. So Weber is engaging this very carefully because he's trying to help to create a stable German society at this time. And so he's also engaging with power and the power of economics. And here is where we see his overlap with Karl Marx. So he says, I'm quoting from Economy and Society, the structure of every legal order directly influences the distribution of power, economic or otherwise, within its respective community. So he's very interested in looking at how power is allotted within society. So he says the social order and the economic order are related in a similar manner to the legal order. Now classes and status groups are phenomenon of the distribution of power within a community. So these are things, again, very few of us sit around thinking about, and that's what makes, I think, these courses so interesting, is that we actually take the time to think about these things, that we move and live among them, and we don't spend a lot of time, unfortunately, considering what it means. And so I've talked about this, I've done this in other classes too, where we map out money and power in North Bay and which parts of town are where wealthier people live, and how does that play out differently? How does their power play out within the town? Who owns property? Who's in city council? All of these things, right? So most of us, obviously, again, we can't be thinking about it all the time or we wouldn't be functioning, but it is certainly, from a Marxist view, the fact that we remain unconscious that allows power to stay in the hands of only a certain group of people. So Weber is very concerned about this. He's clearly concerned that societies can descend into chaos and anarchy, and how dangerous that is. And so he wants to see what establishes a legitimate social order. So Weber starts to break down how cultures create legitimacy and authority in the given culture, and he starts out with traditional authority, which is belief in traditional religious and cultural rules. So again, we saw this with social action based on the sanctity of age-old traditions and parallels traditional legitimacy. In such a system, loyalty is to the chief, whose power is sanctioned by tradition. So we can see religious and cultural authority would fall under this rubric. And so he goes on to say, to start with the simplest form, traditional authority exists where people believe in the sanctity of age-old rules and powers. The leader is a personal master with a number of personal followers. The traditional master's commands are limited by tradition itself. So these are those old forms of authority. And so they can also be found within the system of the patriarchal family, which he says is the original form of traditional authority. So if we look at the original form of the patriarchal family, it would often, and certainly in the ancient Roman world, include a man, his wife, children, and often slaves and servants. So that's all considered to be under his purview. And it comes down to us in the present day, as you know, people will still sometimes say that somebody's got to wear the pants, somebody has to be king of the castle, this kind of thing. So it's a kind of a traditional feudal mode that even comes into the family system. So I think we have to be careful here, because there can be a tendency in these analyses to look at this as something from the ancient past. But I would argue that traditional, if we look in religion, let's just look at the Pope. Traditional authority exists, and the Pope oversees a billion people. So this isn't a thing of the past. And it's based on a lineage from the past. It's a very important part often with religions. If we look at the Hindu system, it's the parampara of the guru and the student, and it goes down the line for thousands of years. So this is still a very important mode of authority, but it isn't necessarily recognized by that secular state. I want to turn now to look at legal authority, which Weber argues is the moral and political foundations of modern capitalistic societies. And again, as I argued, there's many forms all acting at the same time within our society, which again is often invisible to many people. But certainly this would be what the positivists and the people coming out of the French Revolution would have been looking at. So the idea of the social order, that's its underpinning is law. And you'll often hear people talk about the law-based order, right? So legal norms imposed on the grounds of expediency or rationality, bodies of law made up of systems of abstract rules which are created. So I think this is really where we can step back and analyze a bit. And again, this is often invisible to us. So I do want us to think about it. So I took a law and ethics course many years ago in my undergrad, and the professor was asking us to think about, do you follow the rules just because you feel that you will be arrested if you don't? So this is good. It's worth thinking about. And certainly I think it's partly what motivates all of us. We're maybe not driving as fast as we want because we might get caught by the police. I'm asking you to think about this. But as she argued, if this were really true, each person would need a police officer overlooking them. And that just is not the case. And no society can function like that. So there has to be an internalized self-policing, or a society cannot function. So I really think, and I've noticed this, that we overestimate legal authority to a huge extent. Particularly, I have lawyers in my family. So from their point of view, it's all law all the time. But as I said to her, how much dealing does the average Canadian have with a lawyer? I would say if you buy a house, you deal with a lawyer for like a second. Maybe if you're going through a divorce, you deal with them for a little longer. But for the vast majority of people, we don't have a lot of dealings with lawyers in a professional capacity, hopefully. So really, anyway, let's look at this and then we can come back to that. So he says on page 150, Weber argues that the following interlocking set of general ideas is associated with the pure type of legal authority. These are the moral and political foundations of modern capitalist and socialist societies. So legal norms are based on agreement or are imposed from above on the grounds of expediency. Now, again, I don't know how much our laws are based on agreement. Like, I think for most of us, we don't even know what they are. We have sort of a vague... You can see this when people are trying to quote the Constitution. They're often wrong. So we have sort of vague notions in our head. So he goes on to say... the fundamental categories of rational legal authority. Official business is conducted according to general rules. For example, government offices are open during regular hours, not whenever the employees feel like showing up. Each organ or agency has a specified sphere of competence, e.g. bus drivers can't do social work, bank tellers can't be doctors. Each office has a limited jurisdictional action. So here's where law might come into our lives. So, although I wouldn't have understood in that way. So each of us, depending on what we do for a living, is given permission to do certain things. He's absolutely right. And so I have to show my credentials in order to do it, hopefully. So if I'm a surgeon, I have to have a certain amount of education. I have to be certified. If I'm a social worker, if I'm a teacher, we all know this. So this is a highly rationalized system where it's not just hopefully based on, I'm somebody's sister or, I'm charismatic or something like that. So this is certainly how Canadian society functions, at least in terms of careers, that it's according to this kind of legal system. There's a hierarchy in each office. Lower offices work under higher ones. Offices are run by technical rules or norms that require technical training to be mastered. Only officials who pass tests or have certificates are hired. Okay, so this gets us into the realm of human resources and organization studies. Now, I'm not covering a lot of this in this course, but I will be touching on it because certainly, as I said at the very beginning of the course, sociology and sociology courses often have to do with organizations and how you function in organizations and training people to work in human resources and so on, or in business. So this is that tension that I flagged when we were talking about the office between HR and the more Michael Scott is a more kind of traditional boss, right, where it's about his relationships with his employees. So the office staff does not own the means of production or administration. Also, their office is not their home. The official's private domicile is separate from his or her public workplace. The official doesn't have a right to his office. It's not his or her property. Administrative rules and acts are written down and kept as documents in the bureau or office. Thus, the core of bureaucratic administration is in the files, which are kept by a series of minor officials or scribes. Scribes. I got to use that one on our HR. Dear scribe. So here we see he's building out that idea of bureaucracy that I brought up when I was first discussing Weber, and we're not necessarily, it is the iron cage, but he's talking more about the legal ramifications of this. So he says the main form of organization for the legal form of authority is bureaucracy, which is largely responsible for the iron cage of rationality. So he goes on to say the officials are personally free and subject to authority only at their jobs. So the idea that your employer doesn't have power in your personal life. There's a hierarchy, and again, we're going to be talking about this a little later on. Again, I think that's one of the myths of our society, that we live within a kind of pure egalitarian democracy, but certainly bureaucracies are highly stratified usually. Each office has a clearly defined sphere of operation. So if we look in the government, there's a Ministry of Transport, of Natural Resources, Foreign Affairs, and so on. So if this isn't true, and if the officials are in some sense forced to work for their chief, then the bureaucracy is in part a traditional form of authority. Now, this isn't to say that within office scenarios, and I'm sure many of you have experienced that, it doesn't end up being more emotionally bonded. And often you'll hear people, particularly if it's a family business, they'll say, you're like part of our family. You have to be careful with that one. Officials are chosen by means of technical qualification, exams, or diplomas. This technical side of bureaucracy is becoming more and more prevalent. So we can see that when we talk about that idea of credential creep. I think your generation is really feeling it, that my parents' generation, having high school was more than enough. In my generation, it had already become a college or university degree was necessary for many jobs, and it just keeps going up. So bureaucrats are paid a fixed salary based on their rank, usually in money. Their job is their main or only occupation. The official is subject to strict discipline and control at work. So this is getting at the way that the legal bureaucracy in contemporary society functions. So the main way it comes into our life would be through work, rather than. I sometimes give the example of, for the early part of my adult life, I was living in an area of town that was largely Greek and Italian, and everything was done on basically on a handshake or just an agreement. So this whole idea of having written contracts, to me was very, very alien. And so my point being that we're all living in different worlds, and in our private life, we're living in a different world than in our public life. And so not everybody works in this scenario. And so, I mean, we can talk about this. We're seeing right now a lot of disagreement about wanting to bring people back into the office. And so you have these bureaucracies saying, no, we can tell you have to come back into the office. And workers and unions saying, well, maybe not. Maybe we need to work this out that we work 3 days a week. So that's out there right now. It's ongoing, this argument about how much control your employer can have over your life. The final form of authority developed by Weber is charismatic authority, and this is one of his most famous ideas, and again is just becoming more and more relevant as the days go by. And so I want to look at this in some detail, and I'll be revisiting it in the religion section because obviously it's important when it comes to religion. So as he writes on page 152, charismatic authority derives from the special qualities of the leader who is seen as having extraordinary superhuman or supernatural powers or extraordinary qualities. These can be of divine origin, as in the magical powers thought to reside in ancient prophets. So when most of us, we use this in just colloquial English, somebody's charismatic. There's the idea that they have some kind of power within their personality beyond what most people have. And they have the ability to draw other people to them and to convince other people. I talk a lot about this. I did a whole course on cults, and within cult structures, what makes it a cult is a charismatic leader. So everything is about this person having these perceived special qualities. Now, in a religious setting, the word is actually coming from religion. It's the idea that it's divine power that person is channeling. But we also use the word charismatic when we're talking about political leaders. And so this idea that they have some kind of, say, rhetorical ability or something about them that it draws people to them and convinces people. So at the bottom of page 152, he says, this can include political leaders, Hitler, Mussolini, Mao Zedong, Fidel Castro, Juan Perón, and many lesser lights, along with cult leaders such as David Koresh, Reverend Moon, and Jim Jones. So as he said above, all cases of transcending the routines of everyday life release charismatic forces. So in many ways, charisma is the exact opposite of bureaucracy. And this is why charismatic people often founder in bureaucratic situations. They generally don't want to be within them because they don't like the limits and the structures and the rules. I've seen this in the academy where you get sometimes a charismatic professor and it often doesn't go well for them. It's seen as very disruptive of the sort of the larger organization. So Weber makes a number of points about the nature of charismatic authority. The key to the power of the charismatic leader is the recognition by his or her followers of the validity of the leader's special powers. So this is very subjective, this idea that the leader has special powers. And this is the result, and this happens all the time with cults, where you or I look at the leader and are like, really? That person? You find that person charismatic? So this is very much a subjective feeling. And I can't go into it in detail, but in my cult course, I spend quite a bit of time on this, of the charismatic system and how charisma impacts the followers. And so This recognition is given freely, but is usually connected to some pretended miracle or revelation made by the leader. So, of course, within religious systems, there may be ways of testing the leader that they're able to see into the future or something like that. If the leader appears to lose his or her magical or heroic powers or meets with failure, the charisma or authority will wither away. That's not necessarily true, actually. That depends. A charismatic community is a group following a charismatic leader and bound together by emotional allegiances. The community has no regular officials. The prophet has his disciples, the war leader, his bodyguards, or agents. The leader and his agents have no regular bailiwick and aren't paid a regular salary. The charismatic aristocracy is made up of followers chosen for their loyalty or degree of discipleship. So we can see this both in a religious setting, but also in a political setting. So if we look, for instance, at Putin in Russia, that the people closest to him have the most power. It has nothing to do with their education or what certificate they have or how much experience they have. This is also true currently in the United States. It's often to do with just personal loyalty of that person to the leader. So pure charisma also ignores economic considerations. The leader is more concerned with his mission or spiritual duty. He or she rejects the economic exploitation of his charismatic powers. I don't know about that. That's not necessarily true either. They may pretend to. Certainly with cult leaders, they're usually making money hand over fist. So they may say they're not, but that's not necessarily true. But I would say certainly the charisma trumps any kind of rational economic planning. So we see with charismatic leaders, they're often terrible at handling money and running societies. So if their system goes on more than a few years, it often has to become a bureaucracy or can't last. So I'll just give the example. The Christian church starts out as a group of disciples around a charismatic leader, but within 100 years, it's a bureaucracy of the church, because otherwise it won't last. Number 5, charisma is a great revolutionary force in traditional periods, I would say at any time, breaking through the walls built by traditional rules and precedent. It depends on the highly personal experience of the master, which is said to be based on divine grace or heroic strength. So this is where we see, and this is what makes it so relevant to our time, that charismatic authority breaks through all these other kinds of authority, including traditional or legal, and is very radical. So it's basically based on whatever that charismatic leader says at that moment. That's what's going to happen. So there's no idea of planning or that it's rational or that it's good for the greatest number. None of that. It just has to do with that charismatic leader's decision. So as he says, charismatic authority is opposed both to rational and traditional forms of authority. Bureaucratic authority is opposed to charisma by virtue of its rational analytic rules, while charisma is irrational, based on the whims or revelations of the leader. Traditional authority is similarly hostile to charisma. It is based on precedents and rules handed down from the distant past, while charismatic authority rejects the past in a revolutionary way. So you can read through this whole section. It's I think it's very interesting to look at our time period through this lens. So he goes on to say, charisma comes from extraordinary political or economic situations or from psychic and religious states, or both, I would argue. So when I talk about the formation of cults, it often comes at times of unrest within society. So if we look at the 1960s, we see an efflorescence of these charismatic leaders and the formation of various types of cults. Also in the 19th century, at the time of the Industrial Revolution in the United States in particular, we see the creation of a variety of new religious movements. So definitely it would appear that these leaders, they may always be there, but they kind of come to the fore often when there's some kind of rupture going on within society. So if we look at Germany, we know after the First World War, Germany, their economic system, their political system was in complete chaos. And so many have argued that you can understand the rise of dictators like Hitler because of this unstable social situation. So it isn't that those charismatic people aren't around, it's that the social situation is not allowing for them to kind of seize power. And so certainly we're continuing, many people are using this analysis looking at leaders in the present day.